The word dinosaur was invented by this man. This man is Sir Richard Owen, very important scientist in the 19th century. So important, in fact, he developed the whole concept of museums. Oh. This is the Natural History Museum, a particular type of museum, rather. And the Natural History Museum is a typical museum in London, but other museums around the world are based on this. The Smithsonian in DC is based on this, and other museums that I've seen. You know the sort of thing, even like in the film Night at the Museum. You go in through a door, you have an enormous hallway with a big dinosaur in it. You get the idea. Right. It's a cathedral to fossils. But what's interesting is that over the door here is carved the words, "To the glory of God." To the glory of God. Because Richard Owen was a Christian, who believed the Bible to be true. And that's why he had this place built. And over the staircase at the back of the entrance hall, his statue was placed after his death so that he could look out over that museum, because that's very important. His statue then was saying something about the foundation of that place, a place built to the glory of God by a man who believed the Bible to be true, who's there looking over the museum that he had built. But he's no longer there. His statue has been moved and has been put into a very dark corner of the museum, and it's been replaced by this gentleman, Charles Darwin. Because the point about these museums now is that they're temples to Darwinism.
Can biological evolution account for the history of life on Earth, for the diversity of life that we see today? Many evolutionary biologists argue that there's overwhelming evidence for macroevolution, and that evidence comes primarily from the fossil record. But yet, when we look at the fossil record, we see that the fossil record doesn't look like we would expect it to look. If evolution indeed accounts for the history of life on Earth, we would expect to see a gradual evolutionary history unfolding in the fossil record, with an innumerable number of transitional forms documenting the transformation of one major group into another major group. And we would see this over and over and over again. Yet what we see when we look at the fossil record is an absence of transitional forms. In fact, Darwin recognized this when he wrote his book on the origin of species. He had a number of chapters devoted to problems with this theory, and one of the problems Darwin noted is this. By this theory, according to Darwin, his theory of evolution, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the Earth? And in fact, this problem that Darwin recognized then persists today. Stephen Jay Gould, the late evolutionary biologist and scientist from Harvard University, said this: "All paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt." And so the fact here is this: the fossil record does not support the evolutionary paradigm. It doesn't look like we'd expect it to look if indeed biological evolution is true. Yet evolutionary biologists are not deterred by these problems. They argue that this simply reflects the incompleteness of the fossil record. And they like to point to examples of transitional forms that they argue do indeed document macroevolutionary changes.
Whales are magnificent creatures, capable of holding their breath for over an hour and diving to over 1,000 feet deep. But where did they come from? Scientists who support evolution suggest whales evolved from a land mammal. For them, the fossil evidence is so convincing, the evolution of whales is offered as one of the best fossil proofs for the theory of evolution. However, scientists who oppose evolution argue that this fossil evidence is unreliable. Darwin thought that whales might have evolved from bears. In The Origin of Species, he wrote, "In North America, the black bear was seen swimming for hours with widely open mouth, thus catching, like a whale, insects in the water. I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered, by natural selection, more and more aquatic in their structure and habits, with larger and larger mouths, till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale." Modern evolution scientists have abandoned Darwin's idea of a bear evolving into a whale. Scientists at the University of Michigan suggest whales evolved from this cat-like animal because of the similarities in the teeth, while scientists at the California Academy of Sciences believe this hyena-like animal evolved into a whale because its teeth are similar to some extinct whales. Biologists in Japan suggest whales evolved from a hippopotamus-like animal based on similarities in the DNA. Detractors of the theory ask, if whale evolution is so clear, and if the fossil record is so abundant, why can't evolution scientists agree upon which land mammal changed into a whale? There is great excitement in the scientific community over the discovery of a few important missing links between a land mammal and modern whales.
But what's good about these particular fossil whale specimens is that they do show us intermediates in the evolution of whales. And we don't often get fossil intermediates, so we can actually trace the development of characters. Say, for example, the evolution of swimming in whales. We don't often have that opportunity.
They have a big exhibit on it in Michigan. I was just there. They have all these things just sitting out there. I mean, they're all there. I mean, you really have to be blind or 3 days dead not to see the transition among these. You have to not want to see it.
As shown in this diagram from the University of Michigan Natural History Museum, Ambulocetus is one of the important transitional fossils in whale evolution. It is thought by some to be a walking whale.
Just in the last 5 or 10 years, we've had some remarkable discoveries of fossil whales. And in fact, there have been discoveries that have indicated that fossil whales had feet and actually walked on the land.
Frankly, I don't know why they could call that creature a whale. Frankly, I just don't believe it. They believe that because they want to believe it.
So this is the tympanic of Ambulocetus. That's the whole bone. This one is somewhat crushed. Usually there's a cavity in the middle, and then the part on the inside is called the involucrum. On the outside, this ridge is the sigmoid process.
Now, is that sigmoid process unquestionable? Because I know that on Pachycetus there were some questions about that one. It was more like a plate or something. Is this one?
No, this one is as questionable.
Recently, some evolution scientists have backed off the assertion that Ambulocetus was an ancestor of modern whales because its eyes are high up on the head, like an alligator's eyes, quite dissimilar from whales and land mammals.
Ambulocetus may be on a slight sideline, and we think that mostly because it's very strange. It has its eyes raised up on top of its head in a very strange way, and it's unusually large for an early whale. But mostly the eyes up on the top of the head seems like an unusual specialization. Maybe it's not on the main line.
Actually, even evolutionary biologists acknowledge that no one of these forms could have evolved into the next one, because they all have features they would have to lose in order to become the next form. So they're not actually ancestors and descendants. But the textbooks don't need to worry about that. But here's the rub. Fully aquatic whales actually differ from these amphibious mammals, in many respects. Some of them, a few of them, there's actually quite a few, are blowholes. So these animals all breathe through their nostrils at the front of their snout. These animals breathe through holes in the tops of their heads. Quite different, anatomically and physiologically.
I was surprised that the skull wasn't more complete. I thought you had this full, because I've always seen the models in the museums of the full skull. How did you figure out what the shape of the skull? Was it based on these bones, or did you have other fossils to go from?
So the shape of the skull is based on the fossils that we have, and so we have the parts that have the eye and the brain case and the back of the snout. We don't have the tip of the snout, which is unfortunate because we don't know where the nasal opening was, therefore. However, we did find the whole lower jaw, so we do know how long that snout was. We don't have a sense for its exact shape. So that's based on related animals. Those related animals all have the nasal opening way in the front, so those related animals would be Cuchicetus and Pachycetus. those have their nasal opening way in the front, so it's likely that Amniocetus had that too, but we don't know that.
So in my book, Zombie Science, I have a chapter on the so-called walking whales. The problem with the series, the fossil series, which is supposed to be, you know, everything an evolutionist could hope for, is that the so-called walking whales are actually more like sea lions or sea otters than whales. They live mainly on land, they give birth on land. Certainly they spend a great deal of time in the water. But whales have to spend their entire lives in the water. And that requires something quite different from what it takes to make a sea lion or a sea otter. Whales, true whales, that is fully aquatic whales, have flukes. That's their tail. It looks like a flipper, but it's not a flipper. It's not a passive piece of skin like a skin diver's flipper would be. It's actually full of tendons that connect it to muscles in the back of the whale, in the tail, the full tail. And the fluke is therefore active in driving the whale through the water. It's not just a passive flipper.
Evolution scientists claim the most spectacular intermediate fossil in whale evolution is Rhodocetus, an animal with 4 legs, a whale's tail called a fluke, and flippers. It would swim using its widened tail fluke like a modern whale, but it had 4 legs like a land mammal. A perfect transitional fossil between land mammals and aquatic mammals. When this video series was being filmed on location at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, the executive producer noticed a discrepancy between museum drawings of Rhodocetus and the fossils. The reconstruction of Rhodocetus had a whale fluke, but there were no fossils of the tail to confirm this. Dr. Phil Gingrich, the scientist responsible for the discovery and reconstruction of Rhodocetus, was questioned how he knew there was a whale fluke on Rhodocetus, since that part of the fossil was missing.
What was the reasoning that the scientists think there was a fluke on Rhodocetus based on the other pieces of anatomy?
Well, I told you we don't have the tail in Rhodocetus, so we don't know for sure whether it had a ball vertebra indicating a fluke or not. So I speculated it might have had a fluke.
Scientist Gingrich also acknowledged that the flippers were drawn on the diagram without these fossils. Now, he does not believe this animal had flippers. Again, his answer was surprising, since the museum diagrams had flippers on Rhodocetus.
Now, since then, we've found the forelimbs, the hands, and the front arm, the arms, in other words, of Rhodocetus. And we understand that it doesn't have the kind of arms that can be spread out like flippers are on a whale. And if you don't have flippers, I don't think you can have a fluke tail and really powered swimming. And so I now doubt that Rhodocetus would have had a fluke tail.
Many experts consider whales to be the best fossil evidence for evolution, but are unaware of these discrepancies.
So the gap between the so-called walking whales and the true whales anatomically is really quite large. Recently, a whale was found in Antarctica. Actually, it was found a while back, but just fully reported recently. The problem with the whale evolution story, or one big problem with it, is that the time in the fossil record between the terrestrial animals, the walking whales, and the fully aquatic whales is very, very short. Before this recent find, it was thought to be 2 to 8 million years, which may sound like a lot, but it's not when you consider all the anatomical changes that have to happen. But this recent find of a fully aquatic whale in Antarctica actually shortens that time considerably, down to 1 million years or less. So in a very short period of time, these animals had to turn from living mainly on the land to living entirely in the water. That's quite a change to happen in such a short time.
fact that we see things out of sequence is troubling. The fact that we're seeing transitional forms appearing after the forms they are supposedly evolving into in the fossil record is known as a temporal paradox by scientists. And this temporal paradox characterizes the origin of tetrapods. Now, when it comes to the origin of whales, we see again a similar type of problem. Supposedly, whales evolved through a series of transitional forms, beginning with some kind of wolf-like creature, Pakicetus, that then evolves through a series of transitional forms to give rise to the first true whales. All this happening in the neighborhood of about 55 million years ago. But just like with the origin of tetrapods, we see that this transition takes place very rapidly in a range of 10 million years or less, and that we have transitional forms that co-occur in the fossil record. They don't appear in a sequential manner. And this, again, is troubling from an evolutionary perspective. It's a pattern that you would not expect to see if indeed these were transitional forms.
On the right, we have a fossil dolphin. Dolphins being the same family as whales. One single nostril or blowhole on the top of its head. So there we are. That's the proof. The Mesonicid has gradually changed over time from here to here. Are you convinced of evolution now? No. Okay, so which of these fossils would you suppose is the oldest? The answer is, of course, the middle one. The middle one is the oldest. Oh, that's a problem, because surely the first one should be the oldest.
Right.
And what you'll notice then in the language underneath, when you look at the time scale, and this thing didn't really come out well in the photo, but you should notice that the time scale contains a sort of smudge there, a sort of smudge. Because what happens is they've decided that this is one of the first of its type, and this is one of the last of its type, so that they can overlap the time scales.
And they're making that up too.
They're making it up. What evidence do they have for it? The evidence that they have is that clearly this evolved into that.
Which they just made up.
This is a circular argument. Yeah. This is a logical fallacy. They have to assume evolution in order to arrange these creatures in that order in order to prove evolution. Now that is illogical. They should not be doing that. But you see that many people, just looking at this quickly, will say, there's the evidence. I've been to London's Natural History Museum. I've seen the evidence. I've seen similar things. I haven't got the photographs from the Smithsonian. My camera didn't work, but there was a similar display there on horse evolution that was doing the same thing, arranging them in an order. When if you looked at it, the fossil of the modern horse, even though I don't accept the evolutionary timescale, the fossil of the modern horse was actually older than some of the three-toed creatures it was supposed to have evolved from. It does not make sense. So they arrange them in an order because they believe in evolution, and then they offer that as proof of evolution.
Right.
That's a poor use of language.
The Darwinian narrative of whale evolution is familiar. A four-legged terrestrial mammal, the size of a wolf or sheep, undergoes a series of gradual biological changes over millions of years.
The standard textbook account I take to be artistic license. When you look at the problem of being a land mammal that finds itself, speaking loosely, in an aquatic environment, and you've got to conduct your everything there, including reproduction, you have to have the coming together of a number of adaptations. And that is unfathomably complicated.
The scale of these adaptations would have to be massive, including a remodel of the skull and muscles to move the nostrils to the top of the head, the conversion of front legs into flippers, a reconstruction of the skeleton, including a ball joint that allowed the tail to move up and down, the transformation of a few dozen teeth into hundreds of plates lined with brush-like fibers, the reorganization of kidney tissues to accommodate the intake of salt water, lungs dramatically enlarged and renovated to withstand the intense pressure of deep dives, the inclusion of a blubber layer for insulation in cold water, and modifications of ears, eyes, and skin to work effectively
in an aquatic environment.
Just think of all the parameters that would have to be modified, and then multiply that by, I don't know, 1,000-fold or more than that. That's the scale of the problem that you're dealing with.
In the context of Darwinian evolution, the most crucial adaptations would involve the male reproductive system. To optimize the whale's mobility in water, its reproductive organs would have to move from the exterior of the animal's torso to inside its abdominal cavity. But to produce sperm, the internalized testes must be cooled and kept below core body temperature.
Unless it's kept below, you'd have no sperm production, period. And in evolutionary terms, sterility means it's a no-go. You don't count in the race of life, so to speak.
One of the necessary conditions of natural selection is the ability to reproduce. You can't have natural selection if you don't have reproductive capability. You can't make the sperm, you can't have reproduction, you can't get natural selection operating. So you've got to solve this engineering problem.
As a male humpback swims, it generates heat, raising its body temperature. To prevent sterility, the whale relies on a refrigeration mechanism designed into its circulatory system. In the non-insulated regions of the dorsal fin and tail, blood is cooled and then transported through a network of veins to the whale's abdomen. Here, beneath a layer of muscles, a web of veins and arteries surround the testes. They are arranged so blood flows in alternate directions, and heat from the warm arteries radiates to the cooler veins. This transfer lowers the temperature of the blood to a safe level before it is channeled to the reproductive organs.
It's a remarkable solution to that problem. It's beautiful, it's anatomically complex. It involves what is called, borrowing from the Latin, a miraculous web of arteries and veins. But can you explain it by some smooth, gradualistic, textbook scenario, little change, fixation? No, it doesn't fit the Darwinian model. In my opinion, you're looking at just a suite of characters that had to have been integrated from the get-go. I mean, it's a non-gradualistic type of change. So the cooling system makes sense because you have internalized reproductive glands. The internalized reproductive glands, however, are a no-go unless you've got the cooling system. You can't explain the emergence of one without the other.
Since 2001, biologist Richard Sternberg has used widely accepted data on mutation rates and population genetics to study the Darwinian model for whale evolution. Sternberg has focused his research on natural selection and the probability of coordinated mutations, the genetic errors in a DNA molecule required for macroevolutionary change.
I mean, I say it's a numbers game. You have to explain it in terms of a number of coincident mutations that just happened to arise and be put into the right combinations to reshape the vertebral column, to reshape the musculature, the nervous system, the eyes, the ears, and on and on and on.
So let's imagine that the transformation you wish to achieve is transforming a leg from a terrestrial mammal into the flipper of a fully aquatic mammal like a dolphin or a whale. Now, we look at our set of mutations that are required. Let's say we've got A that's going to affect the bones. But you think about your own limb, it's not just bones. There are muscles and tendons and nerves and associated behaviors. So you look down your list of mutations and you go, well, I've got A starting my transformation, but I need B, C, D, E, and F as well. So the challenge of cooperative mutations is to have these events occur in space and time in such a way that they can jointly work together, cooperate, to bring about the transformation that you need. But you know what? Those mutations, they're accidents in the genetic material. They just happen. So you're essentially relying on luck. And odds are you're going to miss the target by a mile.
In 2008, researchers at Cornell University calculated the time required to generate randomly a single pair of cooperative mutations in a population of large mammals. Richard Sternberg applied these calculations to his ongoing analysis.
And they came to the conclusion that, sure, you can get these two coordinated mutations, but it is a problem. It's a problem because you need, as far as we know, on the order of well over 100 million years to give you the coordinated mutations that would, just two, that would give you some beneficial modification. And by my reckoning, to account for the transformation that you'd see, you need far more than two mutations.
If two cooperative mutations are established in a population of mammals only once in 1,000,000 centuries, then a significant challenge to the Darwinian model rises from the dust of the earth. According to the most generous interpretations of the fossil record, the longest possible time frame for the theorized evolution of a land-dwelling animal into a whale is 9 million years. That's a fraction of the 100 million years required to produce a single pair of cooperative mutations, and just one of the countless anatomical changes necessary for natural selection to succeed.
So when you just plug in the math, and there are various ways, I mean, what you've done is you've exceeded the time that the geological record provides you with. And then you start saying, okay, now I'm going to rely on these coordinated changes, and it's kind of game over.
You don't have to have a PhD in mathematics or population genetics to see where this is heading. Even if I grant you millions and millions of years, 5, 10, 50, 100 million years to bring about this transformation, you still face these very real limits of population size, mutation rate, generation time, and the number of features that have to be modified. If the process in question is not going to happen, it's not going to happen, and it really doesn't matter how much time you have. So have all the time you want. If this transition occurred, it did not occur by an undirected Darwinian process. That simply is not possible biologically.
Darwinism provided an explanation for the appearance of design and argued that there is no designer, or if you will, the designer is natural selection. If that's out of the way, if that just does not explain the evidence, then the flip side of that is, well, things appear designed because they are designed.
Think about echolocation from a problem-solving standpoint. What do you need? I've got to make the sound, number one. Number two, I've got to transmit it. I've got to get it out into the environment. All right, now I've got echoes coming back. Those have to be received, but that's not enough. I've got to process them. I've got to take that incoming information and turn it into something that I can actually use and understand. Making the sound, transmitting it, receiving it, and processing it are necessary elements of echolocation. And if you take away any one of them, let's say we take away transmission, it doesn't matter if you have the other three, you lose the system as a whole.
The challenge of building a complete system grows when the 4 phases of echolocation are broken down into their specific components. For to create the entire mechanism, each of the hundreds of individual parts required must be integrated and fully functional simultaneously.
So you've got all these different components for the sonar, and how does the dolphin know how to use this equipment? That's where instinct comes in. They not only got the hardware, but they got the owner's manual along with it. Instinct is a set of instructions on how to use the equipment, and it has to know that from the second it's born. All of this stuff happens automatically, and it's perfectly set up. It's like you look at it and you say, of course, that's the way it's supposed to work. So it's pretty hard to believe that this all happened by chance and natural selection, especially when each individual part is meaningless without the whole.
As a creative agent, natural selection is severely limited. By definition, the process uses random genetic mutations to slowly build or modify organisms through trial and error and small gradual steps. Each incremental change is made blindly, without any sense of an ultimate purpose or objective.
What it cannot do is visualize a distant functional endpoint and say, well, I'll need this part, and I'll need this part, and I'll need this part. Any evolutionary process you consider, any materialistic process you can consider, has no foresight. It can't see 5 years, 5 seconds, 5 milliseconds into the future. For that, you need a mind. Only minds, only intellect, only a conscious, purposeful intelligence has the ability to say, that's my target, how can I hit it, what would I need to bring together to do that? That's what we do, that's what designers do, that's what minds and intellects do. Undirected physical processes can't do that. This is rational, it's reasonable. It's taking the evidence and saying, what's the best explanation for what I see?
So then how do we explain these forms that seem to be well adapted to live at the water's edge, whether they're fishopods or supposedly transitional forms leading up to the origin of whales? Well, again, I would argue that these are well-designed organisms, perfectly suited to live at the water's edge. And I would view them as being creatures that were created by God, that existed in this environment and then later disappeared. And that whales were created through God's direct intervention, as well were the first vertebrates on the land, the first tetrapods. And so again, these transitional forms are actually well-designed creatures that live at the water's edge, where scientists are imposing a pattern on this data because they look at this from an evolutionary vantage point, with that perspective, with that bias in play. Let me illustrate this with an example of a mosaic design that probably almost everybody's familiar with, particularly if you like to eat at certain fast food restaurants. And that example would be a spork. This, of course, is an implement that has the properties of both a spoon and a fork. Whoever produced this object felt like this would be an ideal implement to help people eat certain types of foods, bringing together, again, the best properties of a spoon and a fork. When you look at the spork, you think this is the work of a designer. You don't think that this is a transitional intermediate documenting the transformation of a spoon into a fork. Instead, you recognize this as the work of a designer. And this brings us to the final point that I want to make today, and that is this: that many of the features that we see in the fossil record that are interpreted from an evolutionary perspective find ready interpretation within a creation model viewpoint.
One paleontologist was quite honest in what he had to say. Eric Gyllenhaal said, "What paleontologists know about the past is as much a product of their imaginations as it is dusty fossils extracted from rocks."
humpback whale is one of the largest animals on Earth. Adult females measure up to 50 feet and weigh 40 to 50 tons. They can live for more than a century. In warm tropical waters, a female gives birth to a single calf every 2 to 3 years. The whales breathe through twin blowholes that expel a double stream of spray visible for miles. Then they quickly inhale enough air to fill a pair of lungs, each the size of a small car. When it dives, a humpback can hold its breath for up to 45 minutes. Their underside is lined with grooves that run from navel to chin. This accordion design allows a humpback to expand its throat as it intakes huge quantities of water whenever it feeds. The whales have no teeth. Instead, they are filter feeders, straining 50 pounds of krill or small fish with every mouthful. Humpbacks have massive flippers, the largest of any animal. The whales raise them to work as solar collectors, a behavior that helps regulate their core body temperature. Their powerful tails are legendary. The flukes measure up to 15 feet across and can propel the whales to depths exceeding 700 feet.
You can say majestic, you can say breathtaking, any number of adjectives, but really in the end the language fails. You have to be there standing on the boat, looking at them. They're as long as a city bus. You know, they've been down underwater feeding, up they come. How do you describe that?
This sense of sheer wonder is universal, and our fascination with the largest creatures in the Earth's history has sparked a rigorous search for the explanation of their origin. It is a search that is both an icon of Darwinian evolution and a challenge to its validity.